Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation-state of their own. The Kurds live in a geopolitical area called Kurdistan, the land of the Kurds, which straddles 4 different countries in today's Middle East: Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. Today's guest is Kareem Abdulrahman. Kareem Abdulrahman is a translator and a Kurdish affairs analyst. From 2006 to 2014, he worked as a Kurdish media and political analyst for the BBC, where translation was part of his job. In 2013, he was awarded a place in the British Centre for Literary Translation's prestigious mentorship program. He translated prominent Iraqi Kurdish novelist Bachtyar Ali's I Stayed at the Night of the City into English, making it the first Kurdish novel to be translated into English. He is also the head of the editorial at Inside Iraq, a political analysis service focusing on Iraq and Kurdish affairs. His recent translation, The Last Pomegranate Tree, also by Bachtyar Ali, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. The Last Pomegranate Tree is published by Archipelago Books. In this conversation, he spoke about Kurdistan, its literature, author Bachtyar Ali, and translation of Ali's work into English.
I was born in the Kurdish city of Suleymaniye in Iraq in 1976, and I lived the first 28 years of my life there. This is where I went to university as well, and I studied English language and literature at university. And from roughly around the time I went to university, maybe halfway through my course, I started reading in English increasingly. And I worked as an interpreter, translator, and so on in my first few jobs when I was still living in Iraqi Kurdistan. I left the country in 2004 and came to the UK on a scholarship. I studied masters in journalism. And after that, I got a job with the BBC from 2006 to 2014.
Kurds are the largest ethnic group without a home nation in the world. Take us through the history of the place, the people, and the language.
That's quite a big question. I'll try to do justice. So for the purposes of this podcast, it might be sufficient to say that the Kurds are one of the most ancient people who have been living in the Middle East. They are spread through 4 countries, 4, I should say, modern countries of the Middle East: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. They basically straddle in the borders of those 4 countries. And the Kurdish areas is one, if you like, big chunk right in the middle. For many people, it might be strange, the idea that you have people who may not have nation state, but the concept of nation state is pretty modern, as until the late 19th century, early 20th century. Most parts of the world were run by empires, and the world had a completely different map, political and geographical map. And for large parts of the Kurdish history, the Kurds were part of these bigger empires. The more recent ones are the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Islamic empires, and so on, the ones before them. But it just so happened that when the Ottoman Empire collapses in the early 20th century, the powers that be redivide the world using their own criteria. And they basically carve up the Middle East in very controversial circumstances, like much of the world, including Africa and parts of Asia, where basically the borders didn't really take into account the interest of ethnic groups and people that live in that area. So because of that, the Kurds found themselves spread over the borders of these 4 countries. And in some cases, the same tribe, the same family, part of them is in this country, the other part is on the other country. In terms of their numbers, there are not established figures because the Kurds are minorities in the 4 countries that I mentioned. And for much of their history, they have been suppressed and they have been prosecuted in these countries. And there has been an active effort on the part of the powers that be in these countries to make sure that the Kurds don't achieve their rights, including trying to make sure that there aren't enough data about the number of the Kurds and all the other basic things that you would need to start building a nation. Their total numbers are anything between 35 to 50 million people across the Middle East. The largest Kurdish population are based in modern Turkey, followed by Iran, followed by Iraq, and then Syria. There are two major dialects, one called Kirmanji, which is spoken by the majority of the Kurds and spoken by Kurds in Turkey and Syria, and the other is called Sorani, which is spoken by Kurds in Iraq and Iran, and that's the language that I speak and the language that I grew up with. Of course, there are many other sub-dialects like most languages, but these two are the major dialects. And one of the key differences between them is that Kermanji is written in a modified Latin script, similar to a modern Turkish, and Sorani is written in modified Arabic script, basically like Arabic and Persian and these languages. And finally, the Kurdish language is a member of the Iranian family of languages, which is part of the Indo-European family of languages.
I understand you have your own parliament and you have your own military too. And you were in continuous state of conflict as a region and as a nation, as a group. So, how do you think it shaped your literature?
That's a very good question. As you know, that the Middle East overall has been caught in so many wars, religious, political, and otherwise, for the past 2,000 years, really. And it has been the battleground for most of the big empires, whether the regional ones or even the global ones. And because of that, the Kurds have been directly affected by all of these conflicts. This has been compounded by the fact that the Kurds have often lived on the margins of larger empires and larger languages. And this meant that more often than not, they had to compete with them, or often they have to fight these bigger forces, if you like. And as I said earlier, they have often faced persecution and repression. For large part of their history, the level of repression got to a point where they were denied their cultural and linguistic rights. And there were times until a few years ago in a country like Turkey, if you spoke in Kurdish, you could be imprisoned for that. And people are today in prison in Turkey for basically speaking in Kurdish. And because of this, it has been very difficult for the language and for the literature to develop maybe as much as the Kurds have wished. And one of the direct impacts of this situation is that for a long part of the Kurdish history remained it was an oral tradition. So poetry was by far the most dominant form of literature because it is easy for people to memorize. It's easy for people to basically transfer to the future generations.
Now, what about translations?
When it comes to translation, there are a number of challenges and there are a number of points to be made. Translation into Kurdish has been happening for much longer than translation from Kurdish into other languages. Because of their position in the world, geographically and otherwise, most Kurds historically have spoken more than one language. So there have never been a shortage of Kurds who are bilingual or even trilingual, and so on. So we have had more translation into Kurdish historically than translation from Kurdish into other languages, especially into European languages. So the further afield you go, the harder it has become to find translation between Kurdish to these languages and vice versa. And obviously, on your podcast, you have interviewed a number of prominent translators from across the world, and even the ones where they speak between languages that have prospered and faced no political barriers, they tell you that we still need to do much more to promote translation, whether it's from French, whether it's from Spanish, Portuguese, or Chinese. So overall, the state of translation into English is not that great. It's not at the level that we translators are happy with. There is much more to be done, although there has been a positive shift in recent years. So when it comes to Kurdish, it faces a number of additional challenges, if you like. One of these challenges is that you don't have many people around the world, Kurds or others, who speak two languages, in this case, Kurdish and English, fluently enough to be able to translate from Kurdish into English. Of course, there are a lot of people who speak the two languages, but that wouldn't necessarily immediately qualify you to be a translator. So that is one challenge. If you compare it to even the regional languages like Farsi or Arabic or Turkish, these languages, you can find institutions in the world, in the West, that have been teaching these languages at university level, some of them for more than 100, 200 years. So because of that, you already, for the past 200 years, these institutions have been producing scholars of these languages. So the responsibility solely on the shoulders of the speakers, native speakers of these languages, to bring their literature into English. But in the case of Kurdish, even today, the number of non-Kurdish speakers who speak English fluently enough to translate and confidently translate from it can be counted by the fingers of the two hands, probably. So it's very limited. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is institutional as well. Because the Kurds have been divided over these four countries, and because they are minorities within larger countries which are trying often to repress them, this means that they haven't managed to have their own institutions, and they didn't have the time, the energy, and the resources to develop their own culture and language actively. More, for a large part of their history, they were caught in the survival race where their survival was more important than anything else. So because of that, for example, we don't have any really authoritative Kurdish English dictionary to start with. There are a number of Kurdish dictionaries, Kurdish English and Kurdish to other languages, but none of these dictionaries are authoritative enough that as a translator you can go to it and for any word you are looking for, you can 100% trust their reliability. And this is quite a major challenge for any translator. Of course, even for languages where you have good dictionaries, the translators often need to be more creative and go beyond what the dictionary provides them. But the dictionary and dictionaries, whether it's collocation dictionaries, when we say a dictionary, it's, like you have a number of different types of bilingual resources, and a basic dictionary is one of them. So this is one of the things that has been lacking. And when you start to translate, you feel the absence of this quite acutely. And the other challenge is that I live in London and I have a lot of colleagues. I know a lot of people who translate from other languages, from Estonian, Polish, Swedish, and so on. More often than not, these languages and their respective countries, they have a lot of great institutions from their universities, from their ministries of culture, from their embassies and consulates, where they will be actively promoting their culture, where they will be actively promoting translated books. They will be holding events. They will be providing financial aid for these projects. In the case of Kurds, this has been quite missing as well. You mentioned that in the past couple of decades, the Kurds in Iraq started to have their own regional parliament and regional government. This has made a small change, but it is still in its early days, and in some cases, this Kurdish government hasn't really invested in the right if you like, cultural projects as well. So because of that, as a translator, and for most people who work from Kurdish, whether they are artists or writers, it means, as well as doing the creative part of the project and activity, you need to be much more involved in everything else. So you need to be more involved in the promotion side of things, organizing events, and in creating contacts, and so on. But if you translate from a more established language, there are institutions that can do some of the job at least. So you know where to start from. And the other thing that is very helpful if you translate from more established languages is that you have a number of seasoned translators who came before you and who can pass on their knowledge to you, or you can reach out to them if you have any questions, whether in the context of translation itself or in the context of how to find a publisher, how to negotiate particular challenges you are facing. So these challenges all together, I think, make it a bit more complicated and more challenging overall to translate from minority languages in general, including Kurdish.
To begin with, you're a journalist and you have a master's in journalism. Now you work for BBC, as indicated. Now, what made you take up literary translation?
I've always been an avid reader of literature from my teenagehood. And as I said, I studied English at university. And initially, my aim was really to have a career that involves writing, translation, and where language is and writing a very big part of my career. But my career panned out in a way where a lot of my jobs ended up being in journalism. Often I had an element of translation in my jobs, including at the BBC, by the way. But I often worked as a journalist, and it was much easier to make a living being a journalist than a translator. However, in 2008, a new Kurdish novel was published by an author that I admired and I still admire a lot, Bachtyar Ali, a very prominent name back in Kurdistan. The novel in Kurdish was called Ghazalnus and the Gardens of Imagination. It was a publishing sensation in the sense that for a small region of the world, the publisher decided to have a print run of 10,000 copies, and it offered Bachtyar $25,000 as an advance payment. And later the book was reprinted a number of times. These are huge numbers for a part of the world where first, in total, you have around, at the time you had around 5 million Sorani speakers who could be, including children, who would have access to the book. So if you transfer this to the UK market, you will have to multiply it maybe by 12 or so. And then until that point, most books, writers wouldn't really be paid for the books they wrote because most of the institutions didn't have that capacity. So I contacted the BBC News website. I said, I'm going to be visiting the region. This book is out. I think this is quite an interesting phenomenon. And not just by Iraq standard, by the Middle East standards, because I did some research. I spoke to colleagues and people from Egypt, from Iran, from much larger countries. And they were saying, even in our countries, this would be quite a development from a publishing point of view. So they agreed. I read the book. I interviewed Bachtyar and his publisher, and I wrote an article about this for the BBC News website. And then I thought maybe I should review the book as well, because I've done all this homework. It's good to do something else about it. And I found that there's a section in the TLS, the London Times Literary Supplement, that was willing to publish book reviews for books that haven't appeared yet in English. So that was published in 2008 as well. And to my surprise, it was on the cover of the magazine that week. So they must have liked the article enough. Now, a literary agent from the US has read the review and got in touch with the publisher and then with me. He said, I'm really interested in this book. I'm wondering, and this is a podcast people wouldn't be seeing my hands, are there professional literary translators? And I'm making the sign of a quote, professional Kurdish literary translators. I said, the fact that no Kurdish novel has been translated into English until now tells you that there aren't professional literary translators. However, I have a good background. I have been writing in English for the BBC. I've been doing translation. I'm happy to give a go. So he said, I need a sample. I need a chapter by chapter synopsis, your biography, the writer's biography, and all of this. There is no guarantee that I will find you a publisher, and I won't be able to pay you. If we find a publisher, then of course the publisher will pay you for the sample and for the rest of the book. And this is normally how it works for a book that's translated into English. Unless it's a very big name, normally the publishers will ask for a sample, or you as a translator would approach them with a sample, and you will only get paid if they offer you a contract. So I did all of that. And at the time I thought, because this is my first effort of translating into English, especially literature, I had a colleague at the BBC, an amazing editor and very avid reader as well. Her name is Melanie Moore, who translates from French and Russian into English. So she agreed with a couple of other friends to edit my sample, or to give me advice on my sample, and I decide which points to take on board. So I went back to the agent, and he said, I'm really sorry. I really like the translation, but the world has changed since we spoke first. We are now post the financial crisis of 2008. I don't think I can take a risk on this, or my agency can do that. However, there is a publisher out there for this book. He gave me a few tips and left. So I thought, I've done too much now to stop, really. Even though the book was 600 pages and I had only translated about 50 pages of it. So I know nothing about how the publishing world works in the Anglophone world. I started to research, I started to read about it, and basically I started from zero. So I contacted a number of publishers, and to cut a long story short, maybe 20 rejection letters, and a year later, I found a publisher. Yeah, so that's how the first book got translated into English. And maybe it's only fair after this long introduction that I give our listeners a short summary of what the book is about. So the book in English was published under a different name. It's called I Stared at the Night of the City. It follows the story of a number of friends led by a poet. They have found the body of someone who was killed in mysterious circumstances in a Kurdish city in Iraq. And they want to know why this person was killed and what's the story behind his killing. The group includes a former assassin, a Hollywood film buff, a woman rights activist who works at a women's rescue center, and she weaves beautiful carpets with the women there. And in their search to find the answer to their question, they come up against the local Kurdish authorities, who are not happy that these people are trying to dig and get to the bottom of why this person might have been killed. And they discover that there are many unexplained or mysterious deaths like this. So the book becomes this huge story and conflict between some people who are trying to find the truth and some people, in this case, the authorities, who are trying to repress the truth. And the authorities are trying to do everything in their power to stop these people from doing this, by trying to buy all the poets and all the people who have vivid imagination to join their camp, by threatening them, by arresting them, and so on. But the book is also a fantastical journey, a magical realist book in the true sense of the word, where a lot of amazing things happen, where you have a garden where at night it turns into an infinite garden where people have amazing experiences and so on. So it's a very multi-layered book. It has multiple narrators. Each chapter is narrated by a different character, and it's a fascinating book. In short, that is the story of the novel.
So, how was the reception for this translation?
It was really good. Of course, it wasn't at the level that we would have hoped for, like most translated books, but it did really well. We, both of us, me and the writer, were really new in this area of promoting books, of what to do, and so on. And we had a small publisher, and most books that are translated into English are initially really, they attract smaller and medium-sized publishers. Only once the writers are established, they'll go and attract bigger publishers. But still, it did pretty well, and we were very pleased to find out that some universities in the US and elsewhere, they decided to include it in their modules when they were studying Middle Eastern culture and literature.
Having published the first novel, did it make things easy for you to get the second novel published?
Yeah, when I finished the first book, as I said, it was 600 pages. And of course, I did this and the subsequent book with my friend Melanie Moore, who was copy editing the book and providing advice. She was an amazing collaborator. So it was a collaboration, even though she doesn't speak Kurdish. So when I finished the first book, I thought, I really don't know if I have it within me to do another book, especially if I have to go through this very long journey. Because it's one thing to be sitting behind the computer and translating. It's another to be chasing publishers and to be making a case for why you should publish this book or not. And it's quite a difficult world. There are publishers and agents. They might show some interest, then they may not get back to you for 6 months. Then they will say, send an email, then you don't hear for another 3 months. So it can be quite disheartening at times. And of course, I was an unknown. Bachtyar Ali was an unknown. The Kurdish literature was really an unknown for this world. So I also understand why, from their perspective, they might have thought we need to tread cautiously here. So out of nowhere, for the second book, I got an email from Archipelago Books, a very established, amazing publishing house based in New York. They said, we have read your first translation. We really liked it. We want to do another book by Bachtyar Ali. Will you be willing to do the translation for us? And I tried to negotiate the best terms I can, but I said, of course, I will be very happy to do that, because this was a different publisher and a shorter book as well, which helps. But yeah, it was a very different experience. But this, as it's something, it has come up in a lot of the interviews you have done on this podcast. This is the life of a translator. Sometimes a publisher might come and headhunt you, if you like. But more often than not, you have to go out and make a case for a book that you want to translate as well.
So the book is of course, the Last Pomegranate Tree. While doing the translation, you mentioned about dictionaries, lack of good dictionaries from Kurdish to English. How did you solve this problem when you're translating?
You had to really take creativity to the next level here. I've tried to make the best use of the dictionaries that I had at my disposal. I have Arabic, although it's becoming a bit rusty because I haven't used it as much as I did 20 years ago when I was living in Iraqi Kurdistan. Of course, there are better resources from Arabic to English. Similarly, I don't really speak Persian, but if you speak Arabic and Kurdish, it's like that's half of Persian, maybe, Farsi. And there are good resources from Farsi into English as well. So sometimes what I would do, I would try to see if I would find that word in Arabic or in Farsi or in some cases in German, because Bachtyar Ali speaks German and lives in Germany. And then from the dictionaries of these languages, we'll try to see what is the equivalent in English. And on top of that, I would try to use Google Images. I would try to consult people who speak the language very well. I would try to describe the word I am looking for, let's say, to Melanie or to someone else, to even to my daughter, who was a teenager at the time and who was born here. You would have to really follow multiple strategies to get to the thing you want, to the outcome that you want.
Now, in 2013, you attended a BCLT workshop for literary translators. What is the takeaway from that workshop?
Yeah, so this is an amazing program. At the time, it was for around 6 months. It's a few hours per month. You will be paired with the seasoned translator. In my case, because there are no established Kurdish translators who can work as a mentor yet for the scheme, they had a category for non-specific languages. So that means your mentor doesn't need to speak your language. They will read your copy and provide feedback based on the text that's in front of them. And my mentor was Sean Whiteside, who is a very established translator and one of the activists of this world, and he's very actively involved in the scene. He translates from a number of European languages, including German and Italian. So I benefit from it in two main ways. One was, this happened when I had already started translating my first novel. So I would take one of the chapters from the novel to Sean, and he will return his comments on my translation. And the second thing is that you get to do through the scheme is that the scheme will introduce you to the world of publishing from A to Z. How to pitch to a publisher, what kind of thing to look out for, how to find a publisher, what do they look for, what are the important events and institutions that you should probably consult, what are the events that you need to attend. And they will invite publishers and commissioning editors to their events to speak to the mentees, for the lack of a better word, about what they are looking for when they hear a pitch from a translator. So the two main things really were not only in terms of my copy and translation and what strategies are there if I am facing a problem or a challenge, in which case Sean will be able to help, but the ins and outs of the industry, how it works and what resources are out there, what events, these were extremely useful. And it really opened my eyes. It also, through this, I managed to establish a very good network with other people who were working in this industry. So I found it very useful. One of my regrets is that at the time I was working full-time as a journalist with the BBC, and I was commuting 3 hours a day. So part of me feels like I couldn't make the best out of it, but still I hugely benefited from it. And also I got to know some amazing translators, some of whom you have interviewed here. I've already mentioned Sean, but Daniel Han and many others. Yeah.
Before we move on to the book and the author, what are you currently working on as far as translations are concerned?
At the moment, I'm not actively working on a book. We are in between books, if you like. Until a few months ago, we were still promoting the Last Pomegranate Tree. We did a tour of the US, a tour of the UK, which went really well. So now we are at that stage where I am thinking about what my next project should be. And because this time no one has come to me, now again, I'll have to start this journey from zero again. I have one book by Bachtyar in mind, and I'll see if I can find a publisher there. So I am in the early stages of this journey.
So how was the experience of meeting readers? And probably you might have met people who have read the first book also.
I think that is really the nicest part of the job. There are many translators who probably enjoy the translation more than the post-translation part of the job. But I personally love that section of the job where you have done your job, it's out there, you don't need to worry anymore about what it is. It's now out of your control, if you like. But I like the fact that I enjoy when I see people, they have read it, and it has made an impression on them. And also, you come across people, so many different readers who have so many different interpretations for the book, but also for your translation. So I found that very rewarding, and also it makes you realize uh, that it's quite a meaningful thing that you are doing, because just someone reading this book could have a chain effect on a lot of other things. They might go on and study Kurdish literature, they might go on and write about Kurdish literature, and so on. And in that sense, it was really rewarding, and I enjoyed it hugely.
Yeah, of course, it's a promotion for Kurdish literature as well, not just for the book.
Exactly. It does both in a way, and given that there isn't much Kurdish literature out there, of course, whether we like it or not, it will be seen as this is going to become, if you like, representative of the wider Kurdish literature. And the other thing is that I like the fact that when we are translating, you are behind the computer, you are stationary, you are in one place. I like the fact that when translation gives you an opportunity to get out of this and to go and see different cities, different parts of the world, meet different people who you wouldn't meet otherwise. So I like the contrast as well.
You must have spent a lot of time with the author too while touring. Bachtyar Ali. Tell us about the author as a person and, of course, about his writing. He's one of the most prominent Kurdish authors, I learned.
Yes. So Bachtyar Ali is one of the most prominent Kurdish authors and also one of the most prolific. He's probably written over 12 novels already, but he is also an established literary critic, essayist, and poet, and a columnist as well. So in total, he might have written over 40 books or so, including, as I said, more than 12 novels. Bachtyar was a member of the generation that came to the scene in the early 90s when the Kurds came to power in Iraqi Kurdistan, and for the first time, there was real freedom where people, writers like him, artists, could write about anything, they could hold seminars. And he was an active member of a group that really changed the way we saw literature, the way we saw how philosophy and psychology, sociology, all these social sciences can be used to interpret the political and social events. And he's a household name back home, and he's probably the best-selling writer right now in Kurdistan. He's a very well-read person. He speaks Arabic, Farsi, German, obviously Kurdish. I don't know if I've met anyone else who is so widely read across different disciplines, from philosophy to psychology to history to literature itself, of course. Of course, he's had the benefit of being a writer most of his life, even though sometimes that meant being a penniless writer. But still, he has dedicated a lot of his time to reading as well as writing. He's a very easy person to work with. He's very understanding of the process of translation. And he really gives me a lot of freedom. Like he says, if something doesn't work in English, it doesn't work. I can't really decide for you, and you should be able to call that. And of course, I will, if it's a major decision and if it's something I need to double check, I will consult him. But he's always present and he's always ready to help. And it's very easy to work with him, because I've come across translators, and I won't name names here. They might love the book they are translating, but they do not necessarily like the persona of the writer
Right.
for whatever reason.
Right.
I'm lucky enough that Bachtyar has both in abundance. But he's one of the few Kurdish writers whose work has now been translated into a number of languages, including European languages. So, for example, The Last Pomegranate Tree has been translated into German, Italian, French, as well as Arabic and Persian. And it has done particularly well in German and Persian. Quite a few of his novels, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 5 or 6 have been translated into German, and more are on the way in various languages. This is one of the things that might distinguish him from other Kurdish writers. The other thing is that Bachtyar has been awarded 2 major prizes in Germany in the past 10 years in recognition of his work and in the contribution he's making to the German language literature. In terms of the collaboration during the translation, so what normally happens is that I will translate a chapter. Melanie will go through my translation, and both of us may have some questions already. It might be about a specific word, it might be about something that doesn't work in the way we see it, and so on. So I will mark all these places and I'll have a phone call with him, and we go through each line. Like on page 8, there's a word in paragraph 4. I don't understand what you mean by this. Or I'm not sure this works here. How about this? And so on. Or is this a reference to something that I don't understand? And then, so we do this chapter by chapter until we finish the book. And once the whole book is finished, me and Melanie will go through the whole book one more time. And by now, we are on our second, third draft. And our ideas about some of the things may have changed again. And we may have new questions. Some of these questions I can solve myself. Some of them I can't. So again, I'll go back to Bachtyar and we'll do the same process. And then when we send the book to the publisher, also may come back, their editors will come back with their own queries and questions, some of which I can obviously answer, and some of which I might need to consult Bachtyar. And again, I will be talking to him and we will discuss and agree on a way forward. So it's a very collaborative process. His English is good enough to read the text, but it is not at a level where he could really judge the English or appraise the English.
Now, do they read quite a lot in Kurdistan?
The book reading culture, it's not very strong. Some of the reasons we have already mentioned why. And there are also some universal things like social media may have affected how much time people have for it and all the other challenges in life. But also the lack of institutions, the way literature is taught in schools, the way novels are taught or not taught at all, I should say, also means the reading culture is not that strong. And of course, there is this debate across the world where most people believe that, rightly or wrongly, that people are reading less and less nowadays. In the case of Kurdistan, this is particularly unfortunate because this new world with its social media and satellite and the internet and all these distractions, they arrived at a time when we were just about to establish ourselves as good readers and for this to become something. Like it's not something that we have been doing for hundreds of years like in the West. As I said, because before, historically, it was an oral culture like a couple of centuries ago. So, yeah, having said that, Bachtyar is a household name and he's widely read. And I think a lot of readers appreciate that his books reflect the challenges that they might be facing, not just as Kurdish individuals, but individuals in this modern world. And this is one of the things that I find fascinating in his books, that it has always 2 legs, if you like. It's standing on 2 legs. One leg is in modern Kurdish history and events. They are always fictionalized, but you can tell this is a reflection of a particular time and place. But the other leg is really trying to dwell on universal questions that human beings everywhere are grappling with. It might be questions with what is real love? What does friendship mean? What does war do to a region? How do victims reach out to each other or not when they are caught in a war? So I think these are questions that are universal. And I think it is this, especially this part of his books, that I think is attracting readers when it's translated into other languages. So you don't need to know much about the Kurds and their history and culture to appreciate the content of his book. And also, he is one of these writers who is literary, but in an accessible way. By literary, I mean that he still pays a lot of attention to the way he tells a story, what techniques he will use, what characters he will create, and so on. So overall, what you're reading is interesting at multiple levels. So even if you are not aware of the Kurdish history or if you are not well versed in it, you still can appreciate all the other things that makes it a good literature, I hope.
Yeah. Now that brings us to the novel that we are talking about in this episode, is The Last Pomegranate Tree. In part, it talks about the Iraqi Kurds, what changed for them after they took power. Right. Tell us about the plot, technique, and key characters from the novel.
The Last Pomegranate Tree is... The book was written in 2003, so that's just before the US invasion of Iraq. The novel is set largely in the 1990s and early 2000s. This is the period when the Kurds came to power in Iraqi Kurdistan, and for the first time they have their own parliament, their own government, albeit within a wider Iraq. The main character of the book is a senior commander as part of a rebel movement. He gets arrested. He spends 21 years in solitary confinement in prison. In this period, he goes through a huge transformation, what life means, what we should be focusing on in life, and so on. When he is arrested, he has a son who was only a few days old. He tells his friend, who is also a senior leader, all I want is that you look after my son until I come out of prison. So when he is in prison, he thinks a lot about his son and what might have happened to him. And when he comes out of prison after 21 years, the Kurds have come to power. His friend is now the top leader of the Kurdish region. And he goes to see his friend. And his friend tells him that, I want you to forget about this search, about your son. I have created a mansion for you. Just go and live in the mountains in luxury, because the world out there have become ugly and I don't want you to become part of that ugly world. And he says, no, he's adamant and he wants to go on his search. In the course of his search, he finds out that his son's name is Saryas, so his full name is Saryasi Subhdam. There are 3 different people who have the same name, and he doesn't know which of these might be his son. So he goes on a journey, and each time he comes across, he thinks he has found his son, but then another Saryasi of them emerges, then a third one emerges. And then the story becomes a journey of fatherhood. What does it mean to be looking for your son? Does it matter if that person is biologically related to you or not? And also, it's at a symbolic level, it's the story of what happens to the children of revolution. Young people who grow in the shadow of a revolution and of the wars, and how they are affected by it. And they all have very interesting stories, but they all carry their own traumas and wounds. And this is one of the transformations that happens in the character already when he is in prison. He sees this connectivity in everything, that you can't just care about one person but not another. You can't just care about your family, but not your neighbors, and so on. And this is further boosted by his search when he comes out, when he meets different people. So it becomes the story of these three different sons he comes across, but also through their stories, we get to know what happened to that part of the world in the 1990s and early 2000s. And all of the story, the entire story is told by the narrator, by the ex-prisoner, on board a boat that's stranded in the Mediterranean. Because I don't want to spoil the story to our readers. Yeah, he ends up there somehow.
And title, I find it very interesting. It has both biblical references and references in Quran too, right? Pomegranate tree.
Exactly. In the context of the novel, there's a pomegranate tree that's sitting on top of a mountain in a remote area. And in one crucial moment of the story, three characters of the book find themselves on top of that mountain under that tree. And when they get there, they just feel this amazing sense of friendship and solidarity. And they just feel very free. They feel free from their daily pains, their problems, next to this tree that's in this place of the world. So I think in this case, it is partly, it symbolizes this solidarity and friendship at a time when people are carrying traumas and going through very challenging parts of their lives. But also, as you said, the pomegranate itself carries a lot of symbolism, like the way the seeds are stuck together and the way they make a hole and so on.
What should be done to get more literature from Kurdistan to Anglophone world? You're already doing your bit, but are there any other translators who have come up after reading your books, your translations, or what do you think should be done more?
Books that the two novels I've translated, the more people read these books, the more publishers will be encouraged to publish more Kurdish books, and maybe especially books by Bachtyar Ali. But also it's about the factors that I mentioned earlier. We need stronger institutions. We need to find ways to promote the Kurdish literature. And a podcast like this will play its role in doing exactly that. And there are some other translators out there. There are some collaborations out there. Some people are working on translation of poetry, some others on fiction. So slowly something is happening. Maybe it's not as extensive as we would have liked, but we have taken the first steps, and that's what I guess that's very important. And also, I'm hoping that by me doing this, it will encourage other people to come and to think it's not impossible to find a publisher for a good Kurdish book.
Now, could you please read a paragraph or a passage from the book, both in Kurdish and in English?
So I'll start with the Kurdish. I'm reading from the opening page of the novel. من لبربیان یەکەم و زانیم کە دیلی کردوم لە کۆشتێکدا لە ناو جەنگڵ و دارستانێکی نادیاردا ئەو پێی گوتم لە دەرەوە دەردێکی کوشندەی وەک تاعون بڵاو بۆتەوە کە درۆی دەکرد باڵندەکان هەموو دەفڕین لە منداڵیەوە وابوو هەر کاتێک درۆی بکردایە شتێکی دیکە ڕووی دەدا یان باران دەباری یان درەختەکان دەکەوتن یان باڵندەکان بە پۆل بەسەر سەرماندا دەفڕین من لە کۆشێکی گەورەدا دیر بووم کتێبی زۆری بۆ هێنام و گوتان خوێنەوە من پێم گوت لێم گەڕێ بڕۆمە دەرێ گوتی سەرتاپای دنیا نەخۆشیە مزەفەری سوحتەم لێرەدا لەم دنیا جوانەدا دانیشە ئەمە ئەو کۆشکەیە کە من بۆ خۆمم دروست کرد بۆ خۆم و فریشتەکانم بۆ خۆم و شەیتانەکانم لێرەدا دانیشە و ئارام بگرە فریشتەکانی منیش بۆ تۆ و شەیتانەکانی منیش بۆ تۆ دەرەوە تاعونە و دەبێت تۆ بە دوور بیت دوور تێدەگەیت تۆ دەبێت لە تاعونەکان بە دوور بیت. From early that first morning, I knew he was keeping me locked in. He told me that a fatal disease, a plague of some sort, had spread outside. Whenever he told lies, the birds would fly away. It had been that way since he was a child. Whenever he told a lie, something strange would happen. Either a sudden downpour would begin, trees would fall down, or a flock of birds would soar above our heads. I was being held prisoner inside a large green mansion within a sequestered forest. He brought me a stack of books and told me to read them. "Let me out," was all I said in response. "There is disease and corruption everywhere, Muzaffari Suhtam," he said. "Stay here in this beautiful world. This is the mansion I built for myself and my angels, for myself and my devils. Stay here and be patient. What's mine is yours. There's a disease out there, and you need to stay away from it. You understand?"